Are you an Apollo user trying to route audio from your Mac into Zoom, Riverside, StreamYard, Ecamm, Discord, or any other app where you talk to others? It can be a frustrating journey because there just doesn't seem to be a good tutorial out there. At least there wasn't a few years ago when I went through this process, and based on a comment from another video I did, there likely still aren't any. That's what I'm addressing today. I had to figure this out, routing audio into Riverside, because I had a podcast client who wanted me to live produce their show remotely. They wanted me to play all of their music clips in real time so that they and their guests could experience the show like it's being recorded live with all of the production. This meant that I had to figure out how to get the clips out of Live and into Riverside, which is the remote recording platform I use for recording client shows. Unfortunately, Universal Audio doesn't make this easy. Actually, it's not too bad if we're talking about just routing a DAW only, but that's a different thing. The complexity really comes into play when we want to route audio from apps that don't give us the choice of input and output audio devices. This is where Rogue Amoeba's Loopback comes into play. It allows us to create virtual audio devices so that we can route audio where we want it to go. It does take some basic planning to do this right. I always like to start with a plan. So the first thing is we need to set up two distinct audio feeds, the one for us and the one for the other person. The first step is to determine the sound sources we want to send to our app. This is what the other person will hear. We'll feed these sources to a virtual channel pair. What I've got here is a screenshot of the Apollo X8 output channels. If you're using a different device, you can get to this screen by opening up Console, go to Options, I/O Matrix, and you'll see this. And if you don't see virtual channels or you need more, you can usually adjust those if you go into your Hardware tab right next to I/O Matrix. Down here at the bottom, you've got DSP pairs, virtual channels. This is where you set how many virtual channels you get. Each device has a different number of virtual channels. I think it depends on the number of chips you have. But that's how we set this up. The other feed that we're setting up is for what we hear. And what we're doing here is we're basically setting up a mix minus scenario to ensure that we can hear the other person without sending their audio back to them, which results in that obnoxious echo. We'll route this source or these sources to a Q output. And before we jump into the loopback, let me stop things and ask that if you're finding this video helpful, that you give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more of my content. Here we are in loopback. So the first thing we want to do is create a new virtual device. You'll find the plus button at the bottom left-hand corner. We'll create that, and we'll have to give this a name. If we look at our diagram, we're routing our audio to Zoom. So let's just call this to Zoom. We'll call this to Zoom. Virtual 1 and 2. I like to name things in a way that is clear to me what they're doing and what I'm using it for. So all of this is going to be audio we are sending to Zoom via virtual channels 1 and 2. So looking at loopback, this left column is a list of our virtual devices. I recommend you keeping this as simple as possible. Mine is really overwhelming because I do a lot of different things. I have a lot of different setups. This large section is where we route the audio. It's made up of 3 columns. We've got our sources, the input sources. So we hit the plus button and we can choose select application, or if the app is currently running, we can select it from here. So let's add Chrome, because we tend to use Chrome for most browser-based communication platforms. We'll add Apple Music. We'll add a DAW in case we're trying to do something with music production, or me if I'm doing some kind of podcast editing tutorial. I want the audio from my DAW coming in. So we've set up 3 input audio sources. They're all being routed to output channels 1 and 2 of our virtual audio device. Next, we need to set up a monitor so we can hear these through our headphones. We'll select our universal audio Apollo. It'll automatically wire everything to outputs 1 and 2. We do not want this. Reason being, those are our main outputs, and we don't want the audio being doubled up. So you click on the line, command click on the second one, go down to delete those. So now we need to go back to our chart to look at which virtual channels, to find out the output channels on the Apollo that correspond to virtual channel 1 and 2. So on my Apollo, that's channels 21 and 22. So we'll route output 1 to channel 21. We'll route output 2 to channel 22. So now all of these audio sources are being routed to virtual channels 1 and 2. This is the audio that the guest, the person on the other side of the conversation, is going to hear. Now we need to set up our mix, what we're going to hear in our headphones. So for that, we need to create a new virtual device. So we'll call this Zoom output, and we're setting this to Q1. So we'll call this Q1. I forgot to mention the first device, pass-through. We generally don't tend to need it. It's never been clear to me exactly what this is for, other than when you turn it on, this audio device will show up as an output in your audio device list. And you can leave this turned on. It's not going to hurt anything. You can turn it off if you're sure you don't need this showing up as an output. But in this case, since we're doing the Zoom output, we're going to be using this as the output device for Zoom or Riverside. We want to leave this on. But let's add our input sources. So if we're using Zoom, we're going to need to hear Zoom. Zoom isn't open, so I have to select the app. Okay, so now we've got Zoom routed. Let's say we tend to use Zoom and Riverside on a regular basis. We'll want to add Chrome in here too. And this poses a problem because we now have Chrome set up in our to Zoom and our from Zoom routings. We don't want that because we're going to get echoes. So since we generally have to use Chrome for stuff like Riverside and a lot of the browser-based recording platforms, we're going to want to keep this in our Zoom output. We're going to want to use a different browser as an audio input source, or rather, the sources where you're sending from a browser into Zoom. So instead of using Chrome, we're going to use Safari, or we might use Firefox. It doesn't really matter which browser you're using. The big takeaway is it needs to be a browser that is different from the one you're using to bring your guest into your world, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to our mix minus or our Q imp or our Q mix. If you're like me, you tend to like hearing a little bit of your voice in the headphones. So let me think this through. Okay, so the way we want to handle this is we're going to route our mic into our Q output, but we'll do that in a minute. Let's set up these sources with our Q. So like we did last time, we want to add our Apollo as a monitor. We'll get rid of these two connectors. Looking at our cheat sheet, Q1 is output channels 29 and 30. So we'll route our audio to 29 and 30. So these two will be routed to Q1, and to bring our mic into the mix in console, we're going to adjust the Q1 knob. So this is basically the send that adjusts how much of yourself you hear in your headphones relative to the other sources in your Q mix. Some people like to hear their voice louder. Other people like to hear it quieter relative to the other sounds in their headphones. So you'll just adjust that using the Q send here. One thing I forgot is it's an important part, but our guest, the person on the other side, they need to hear us. So we need to add our mic. So we'll go back, we'll add our Apollo as an input device this time. It's going to automatically route channels 1 and 2. My mic is connected to input 1, so we'll leave this connector, but we also want to connect it to channel 2. That way the mic is coming in on the left and right channels when our guest is listening to us. So now we have our two custom routings done. We've got our to Zoom, which sends Apple Music, Safari, Hindenburg, and Firefox to Zoom or to Chrome, wherever we've got things set up. And we've got our Zoom output, which is bringing Zoom and Chrome in as input sources into our headphones, and it's not sending it out to our guests. When you go into Zoom to select your input and output devices, for input or mic, you're going to choose to Zoom. And for your speaker or output device, you're going to choose Zoom output. That is the most basic setup. You've got two routes, one to your virtual channels 1 and 2, and one to your Q1 mix. Like I said, double check your Q outputs to make sure your Q is going to the right headphone amp and that you have that set to the custom mix and not to, let me clarify that because we have the mix button. The mix button here sends the monitor mix. This is what would go to your monitors that are connected to your Apollo. Here we want the Q1 mix. So make sure it says Q1 down here. Make sure it does not say monitor mix. Okay, so that's our most basic routing. You can start to do more complicated routings, like route each browser to your virtual channel of choice so that you can create submixes. but that starts to get a little overwhelming, and I really don't recommend that unless you have a very specific use case. When it comes to loopback, you want to keep things as simple as possible, just because if something goes wrong, the more complicated your setup, the more of a pain it is to go in and troubleshoot. And I've spent days over the last few years just troubleshooting, trying to make things work because my Apollo died a few months ago, so I had to put the Rodecaster into use. I had to create all new routings. And I have clients who sometimes need coaching on the Rodecaster or the Mackie DLZ. So I have to create custom routings for these different audio interfaces, and I need to keep them here for whenever I have to use one of these other interfaces. But like I said, I really recommend keeping loopback as simple as possible. Make the naming as clear as you can so it's easy for you to know which mic you're using for Zoom or Riverside, Ecamm, whatever, which device you're using as your speakers. Because if you get that wrong, you're either not going to hear somebody or they're going to hear themselves echoed back, and that's just not good for anybody. I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.